Now I'll proceed to the second phase of the landscape painting. In this phase, I'll finish the painting by creating details in the middle ground and on the foreground. These areas need texture. I'll create this with a specific texture brush. How to create one is shown on the previous video. I use a normal texture brush for the trees. It's created from one of the default brush tips. I'll work on the shadow areas of the trees with this texture brush. The shadows on the foreground are quite dark. I can paint with the texture brush also to the negative direction. I'll overdo some of the contrast on the shadows on the foreground trees, making the ones nearer to me more black than the ones a bit more far away. I'll create another texture brush which is more vertical. I rotate and flatten the brush and make it change its angle much less. I'll use this brush for the pine trees on the middle ground. I'll start with the color of the shadow, bluish gray. I'll zoom in both the reference and my painting. I'll also work on the other details on the middle ground, using lasso if needed. Next I'll do some lighter trees. I'll make the brush more loose and create gray-brown trees on top of the shadows. In the middle ground, I need to be careful not to overdo the textures. There shouldn't be too much contrast on the texture. I'll work on the detail on the sandy area. I'll make some light effects and cast shadows for added reality. Next I'll continue to the foreground, working on the trees on the positive and negative directions. Next I'll create some texture noise to all of the shadowed areas. After this, I'll start to block in the lighter areas on the pines. I'll start this with a quite dark color. Then I'll continue to lighter colors. Often the light areas of trees are quite yellow. So it might be that the shadow of the pine is blue and the highlights yellow. This looks like green to us. Next I'll do some dry branches. I'll first draw the branches with a lasso and paint them brown. I'll continue on working on the lighter areas. Sometimes I need to add some shadows. I can use the lasso or quick selection tool for this. I first started with the pine on the left. I'll now use it as a stylistic reference for the other trees. The closer the object is, the more textured it should be. So the tree on the left and the one on the middle are the most important ones. These should have the most texture, the tightest edges and the deepest contrast. When texturing the trees, I try to avoid repetition. It's really human to repeat the same shape over and over again. The shrubs on the ground are quite hard to do. I don't give it a lot of attention. I'll deepen some of the shadows with the help of the lasso. I'll reduce the size of the brush when working forwards. Next I'll do some of the twigs in the foreground. These I will create on their own layer. If you have these types of objects, it might be best to use a separate layer. I'll first draw the twigs with the lasso and paint them brown. Next I'll lasso draw the leaves. I'm pressing Shift for adding areas to the selection. The lasso is quite good for leaves. Separate leaves should have quite tight edges. If I have objects on their own layer, like the leaves in this painting, I can lock transparent pixels. Now my paint only affects the pixels that already exist on the layer. So it only changes the color on the twigs and leaves. I'll release the layer lock and continue on working on the leaves. I'll continue on working, all the time proceeding to lighter colors. I'll create one more brush for flatter highlights and shadows. I'm now happy with the exercise. There is more texture in the foreground and in the middle ground. The depth illusion is quite okay. I only painted the closest leaves on their own layer. In my image, I could have also done the left trees as separate layers. You should always try to keep your files flat as possible. I hope you learned something about painting environments.